Hi, how are you? Welcome to a new episode of the podcast, the Broken Not Broke interview, where we discuss the financial impact of childhood cancer in families and households. But more important, we talk to leaders of foundations and organizations supporting these families about the programs they have, about the solutions they offer, and other relevant topics for the childhood cancer community. My name is Adrian Franco. I am the Executive Director of the Guarini Institute at NJCU that sponsors the Broken Not Broke initiative that includes a database of almost 500 organizations across the country that support, in terms of financial assistance, families affected by childhood cancer. Today, we are honored to have John Cioini, who is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Children's Leukemia Research Association, a very impressive foundation that is almost 60 years old now and has been providing grants for research and also financial assistance to many, many families as well as institutions. John has a very successful career in philanthropy and higher education. He's also a Marine Corps veteran, but also very important to mention, he's the father of Noah, who we are happy to report that he recovered from leukemia. Myself, I'm a cancer dad. So, in this community, we love to talk to each other because it's a very unique experience. John, thank you very much for joining us today at the Broken Not Broke interview.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
As always in these interviews, we like to talk just about the impact. We have many numbers now. I read in your website an estimate of $200,000 to $800,000 for a leukemia treatment. Give us more color or more details from your observations about the financial shock that families have when a kid is diagnosed with leukemia.
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind in kind of in our situation when my son Noah was diagnosed in March of 2020 is kind of the immediate and unexpected disruption of your family's life, but not just that, but your work and your income. In our case, everything pretty much stopped when Noah was diagnosed with T-cell ALL, kind of that morning of March 5th. And so for that first 9 months of that frontline treatment, you're looking at frequent long hospital stays, very frequent clinic visits, surgeries that are kind of starting right away. So there's situations where families could be hours away from home. We're lucky enough that we're up here in Rock Hill, South Carolina. We're very close to the Levine's Children's Hospital, but there are families that are not. And so that's certainly a struggle that they have to deal with. So you're looking at a cost of travel, lodging, meals, unpaid leave from work that's stacking up very quickly for families, even looking at insurance, with high deductibles and copays and uncovered services that you didn't even know you needed at the time. That creates a real financial strain very, very quickly. And so while you're still trying to get over the shock of the initial diagnosis, now you're kind of being thrown into this financial scenario where you're trying to figure out how your family is going to make it with one income or potentially no income for a period of time. Because there are a lot of times parents often have to leave work or have to reduce their hours. And this was certainly our reality as we had to prioritize Noah's care within at least the first year of treatment. I know I went on FMLA, my wife went on FMLA for periods of time. So then you're looking at how do we balance out the financial aspect of this. And it's a real struggle that families deal with. And, there's certainly things that can, resources out there that can be helpful, but I think it's just understanding what is available is the key to it all.
Thank you for sharing that, John. Tell us about how this financial shock evolves. I mean, you mentioned the impact of diagnosis, and I think all families can relate to that. First day, first week, first month of treatment. Well, what happens later in monitoring survivorship?
Yeah, so I mean, I think about that. When I think about that, over the span of the 3 years where he went through kind of what I consider active treatment, I would break that up into really kind of three phases. Looking at that early phase that I talked about, that frontline treatment, so that diagnosis, that initial response, and that's that stage where you're beginning with those emergency room visits and the intensive testing and really that immediate hospitalization, because once you get the word, it's go to the hospital right now, and then it all really starts going from there. And so it's really kind of a time where families, what I would say, are in shock, right? And they're forced into this kind of survival mode, and then they're dependent on so hopefully the support system that exists around them. And I consider us fortunate that where we are and where we live, we have family here that can help us with that. But there are families that don't have that support system right there readily available to them. And then those expenses immediately start stacking up. I've talked about hospital stays, but also surgeries. If you have your child, or if you're getting a PICC line or a port that's happening. My son had to get a G tube put in at one point very early on in his treatment, so that's another piece that you don't think about. In testing, and the time frame of this is a very big shock for families. And so you're looking at therapies that are happening and blood transfusions and all those things. So that all of that is financially just compounding on the families. And so next, I kind of look at, if we're moving on from that, the initial 8 to 9 months, you're looking at kind of that middle phase, which would be considered, I'd say, maintenance, or that ongoing treatment. And so there's a lot of misconceptions that once you get to that phase, it's over, and it's not. That's really kind of where it's beginning, right? And so the initial crisis may subside a little bit, as far as now we're in a routine and we know how to deal with this. But then you're kind of into that stabilization, but the costs certainly don't stop, right? And families now are kind of managing a daily regimen of like oral chemos and infusions, and specialty prescriptions and lab work, and then dealing with the side effects of all of that medication, and trying to combat nausea and neuropathy and those types of things. And for kids like my son Noah, that had to then have a G tube for feeding, that families have to pay for all of that. And so the nutritional support is a very important aspect. So there's just a lot of things that compound on top of just your typical therapies, like your chemo and your radiation. There's a lot of compounding medications and stuff like that have to be brought into that. And then I think about like that later phase of post-treatment survivorship care. That financial strain does not end when treatment does. Families then enter into a long-term survivorship phase. And so that's frequent follow-up visits with oncology, neurology, cardiology, doing scans and lab work just to make sure that the blood levels still look good. Therapeutic support like feeding therapy, what my son is going through right now, physical therapy at times, and certainly mental health counseling. So that conception that once you get to the point where you're in remission, the treatment certainly does not stop, and it goes well beyond that.
One of the things that we really focus here at Broken Not Broke is the economic mobility, and we define it as the extent that families can move up the income and wealth ladder. Tell us, based on your experience, but also what you have seen in the association, what happens when you put together this phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 in terms of where you are in the income wealth ladder. Any experience on that will be very helpful to our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, I think about from a family's perspective of when you're dealing with that and kind of going through from the beginning stages of it. I mean, things like delayed career advancement, and forced job changes for caregivers, specifically of those that are parents taking care of a child that's going through this. In our case, I had to leave a full-time job working for the Red Cross at that time to then go to a part-time job. So those are real scenarios that happen, and it's a forced a forced thing that has to be done to prioritize the care of your child during that treatment. And so even, when you're entering the workforce after treatment ends, I mean, that can be very difficult because, you've got that interrupted tenure of that job, but also you're trying to get yourself back into the workforce and figure out what that's like while still trying to care for your child. There's long-term debt from treatment that families often deal with, medical loans and dipping into retirement savings and those types of things. And at that point, you're doing everything you can to take care of your child. And so those out-of-pocket expenses for ongoing care do not stop. The therapy can keep families in a cycle of financial instability for years to come. And that actually can transition to generational as well. And that can be passed on well after that. And so I think that's just kind of the misconception that's out there a little bit, or maybe not misconception, but just knowledge and information that needs to be shared about families that are going through this. And you don't truly understand it until you're in that position.
Thank you. I think you gave a very, very specific scenarios that unfortunately we hear from most families in terms of career advancement and debt, retirement savings, etc. So I thank you so much for sharing all those details. Let's move on to talk about the Children's Leukemia Research Association. Again, 60 years since it was launched and founded. It's obviously has gone through many years of seeing how research has advanced or not in leukemia. But we are very thankful to associations like yours that keep sending funds and offering grants to institutions and researchers that can make a difference. We're specifically interested in the financial support, but before we get to that, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how advances in research or in cure and caregiving can impact the financial toxicity of leukemia.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a real thing. I think, the first thing that kind of comes to mind is that improved survivalship, right? The longer the treatment timelines are, and that's all thanks to the innovations that have happened over the years. If you think back into the 1940s, 1950s, a child with leukemia, truly there was no cure for that, right? The treatment wasn't there to be able to treat for that. And so patients now are living longer, but this also requires prolonged medical care. And so that's often for years. For my son, when he was diagnosed with T-cell for boys, that treatment was typically 3 to 3.5 years. And I think they've certainly made some changes to that based off studies that have been done, but all of that increases the cumulative out-of-pocket expenses for families over time. And then, we look at new therapies that exist right now, like CAR T, for those families or for those children that are going through relapse, right? And so that's certainly offering hope, but that is at an extreme cost. Those treatments and those immunotherapies are certainly game changers in the clinical world, but they can be financially devastating for a family where a single infusion can cost up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, and not including kind of the hospital stays and the follow-up care that happens after that. And then I also think about out-of-pocket expenses and those costs that impact those uninsured families, right? And so families with private insurance are still facing high deductibles, depending on what kind of insurance plan you have, those current co-insurances and those copays. Those are often hit hardest during the most intense treatment upfront and that frontline treatment periods, when your income is reduced at that point in time. So there's certainly a lot of things that equate to the advancement of research and treatment, and then the families that are then dealing with the financial aspect of that toxicity and trying to maneuver for their child, but still trying to maintain their household and all of that.
Tell us about the patient aid program. We saw the numbers and obviously very very impressive $1.8 million to over 600 patients. But it still seems, but it seems like a more recent program compared to the original grants for research. And what was the genesis of this?
Yeah, so I mean, this really was how I became connected to CLRA was through their patient aid program. At that time, this was early on. I reached out looking for resources. I think and I would say our kind of light in the darkness at that point in time was our patient navigator, who was kind of the key person to help you navigate this horrible journey. And so they provided us with organizations that exist, and luckily it came across CLRA and their patient aid program. And so they will help offset the cost of treatment related to expenses that are not covered by insurance. And at that time, we're just going off of our insurance, not really sure what was going to be covered, what wasn't going to be covered. So looking at prescription medications, doctor's office visits, therapies, chemo and exams and blood tests, all the things that are happening in that period of time, all accumulating all at once, they help directly with those payments. And so the thing I would say that stands apart from CLRA and other patient aid programs that I've seen is, one, they don't require income verification. So that's a big game changer for families, because that reduces the barrier for middle income families who I would say fall through the cracks, right? Because they're kind of in that middle area where they can't necessarily afford it, but they make too much money to be able to be eligible for it. And then also just the way that they've set up the application process, it's very easy. It's not overwhelming as some of that I have seen, because oftentimes when you're kind of going through this, you're navigating those complex aid programs, and those can often be a deterrent for not submitting an application to get that help. And so really it acts as a lifeline for families navigating really one of the kind of most emotional and kind of financially difficult times in their life. And so I was thankful that they existed then for me. And so that's really what brought me into this organization. So now I can help be a part of that for other families that are going through the same thing that we did.
I think that point about the middle class falling into this gap is so essential. You don't see that in many organizations or even in the research. But I agree with you that in many formulas to decide who receives aid or not, there is this group of people who might seem to make a lot of money compared to others, and they are, but you have to take into consideration geographies and other variables that will also impact that family both in the short and the long term. So it's very important to have that, and I'm glad that you and the organization has that view. I also noticed that compared to organizations that you provided support directly to patients as opposed to paying, providers like utility companies, etc. Could you tell us the rationale for that?
Yeah, I mean, in that way, it helps. It goes directly to those patients to help with that funding. And so, I think back to when we were going through treatment and needing that funding to go, it helps directly to the patient. And oftentimes, the kind of rerouting directly to payment to vendors can be very tricky. And so that really kind of removes that roadblock for families. And so that's part of the rationale for that. And it really was all about making the process as easy as possible for families, because when they're going through something that this kind of devastating, the last thing that we think they should be thinking about is how they're going to be able to afford to live. And so removing any kind of roadblock that exists is really at the forefront of what we're trying to do.
And you're definitely doing it in a very impressive way. And last question, John. We have talked about the implications with families and household, but if you wanna think about the policy or systemic changes that will be needed to support or to ease the financial burden of childhood cancer, what would you recommend?
Well, there's one thing that I would say that was really kind of the saving grace for us, and we learned of it. This is something that was passed on by our patient navigator. We learned of it in thinking back to March of 2020, right as COVID was starting, right, and shutting everything down. Kind of our lives were shutting down at the same time, and so the one part that really was our saving grace was the expanded access to Medicaid options like Tefra, right, and so that's what's considered the Katie Beckett waiver, the Tax Equity and Financial Responsibility Act that was passed in 1981. And really what Tefra does is it allows children with serious illness to qualify for Medicaid based on their medical need and not the family income, because we were in that category of we made too much money at that time to be able to qualify for Medicaid. And so we wouldn't have been eligible, right? And so we're looking right now, I believe, if I'm quoting this right, there's about 18 states currently that have Tefra available to them, and we're lucky that South Carolina is one of those states. And so there are other states with kind of limited availability and waivers like Tefra, but it covered what private insurance didn't. Now I'll say it did take us for about 3 month process to get to that point, but once we had Tefra in place, it really just took a immense weight off of our shoulders. So if I had to point to anything that currently exists that I think should certainly be expanded across the nation to other families, it would be that. And I don't think any family should, or individual that's going through cancer treatment should be financially ruined based off of that diagnosis. And that is right there is something that could certainly assist them. It helped with chemo-related medications, Noah's G-tube supplies, feeding support. It just really removed that major financial stress, kind of allowing us to focus on Noah's care and not so much how are we going to survive over the next 3 years.
Well, absolutely. Can relate to that. Great recommendation about the expansion of this provision. We're ready to conclude our interview today. So to recap, I wanna stress a point that you make about this flexible criteria that the Children Leukemia Research Association had for patients, and your emphasis of trying to remove roadblocks for access to aid. So we recommend everyone to visit your website, children'sleukemia.org, and we will have it in our newsletter as well, so people can know how to visit it. And also, if you have the opportunity to donate money, please consider the great work that this association with 60 years of impact is having. Thank you again, John. We truly appreciate your presence today and everything that you are doing. Anything else that you want to comment?
No, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for allowing me to speak with you today. And just, organizations like CLRA only exist based off of the generosity of those that are out there. So I would just go to the website, take a look, and see how maybe you can impact a family that's going through this.
So remember, children'sleukemia.org. And also you can visit our website, brokenNotbroke.org, where you can access our database of almost 500 organizations in 50 states and Puerto Rico that provide financial support to families facing childhood cancer. Thank you, everyone, again, for joining us today. Thank you, John. We appreciate your time.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.